What is tempo? So tempo is a forgotten about training variable that we can also use to manipulate training stimulus. We can also use it to dictate the amount of time under tension your muscles are working, and it also gives us light on the training effect we're after. We can also use the tempo to dictate the emphasis of where we want to really overload the stimulus of the lift. Now, something to recognize before we go into how it's written on your training card is 4 different muscle contractions that we can use in order for us to get what we're after. Now, the first one is an eccentric contraction. Now, this is the stretch or the lowering phase of the lift. So, for example, on a bicep curl, it will be lowering down the dumbbell before you would lift it again. Now, we know that the eccentric portion of the lift allows us to recruit more muscle units than the one that most of you are familiar with, the concentric phase. So that's the lifting. What eccentrics also allow us to do is learn to absorb force. So if we can get good at doing this, again, it will translate into us lifting the load up. So eccentrics are really important for this. The other thing that it allows us to do is train the muscle under load in a stretched position. So it's good for flexibility and range of motion purposes. It also allows us to overload the end ranges of lifting, where a lot of us who may be a little bit inflexible would have difficulty with. It allows us to train the end ranges. Another lifting property that we should be aware of, and most of you may be, is the concentric, which is the opposite to the eccentric. It's the shortening under load or the lifting. So again, in a bicep curl, it'll be doing this. Most of you are familiar with this type of lifting. Now, the other 2 that you should be aware of is isometrics. And now isometrics is us holding a joint angle statically, and this would be under load and would get strong in that joint angle. The other thing isometrics allow us to do is get strong +5 and -5 degrees of that angle. So we can use it to overload areas in which we're weak. For example, in postural lifts, so for example on a seated row, most people are weak when the cable, for example, is at the chest. So we can spend time in this isometric position, allowing us to get stronger here. Isometrics are a cool tool in which we can do this. And the final one is isokinetics. Now, isokinetics is just same speed lifting between eccentric and concentric. So for example, you might do 2 seconds on the way down in the eccentric and 2 seconds on the way up on the concentric, and keep that consistent throughout your lift. It's important we understand these 4 different properties. Now, going over to your program card, you may see tempo written, or you will see tempo written in 4 digits. For example, you might see 4010, or you might see 3011, or 2111. Now, it's important we look at these and justify what the different numbers represent. Now, always, the first number will be your eccentric. So for example, if it says 4010, it basically means your eccentric must be done in 4 seconds. So going back to that bicep curl, we know eccentrics are the muscle under load in the stretch. So if it says 4 seconds, it suggests that there should be 4 seconds of us lowering the dumbbell into the stretched position. The second number, so if it says 3111, the second number would be 1. Is the isometric pause in the end range of the eccentric. So, bicep curl, we've gone down in 3 seconds, let's say. It basically means in that end range, in that bottom position, we should hold for 1 second. We can use this for various reasons. Sometimes it's for us to negate the stretch reflex, for us to stop the movement pattern happening at the bottom in order for us to really emphasize our concentric. Sometimes it would be just to overload an area which we know you're weak in. It's important that you adhere to it if it is prescribed. The third number is the concentric. Now, we're familiar with this. It's the lifting, the shortening of the muscle. Again, going back to the bicep curl. If it says 4010, then basically it means you should return the dumbbell back to its start position in 1 second. So you go 4, 3, 2, 1 on the eccentric, and there's a 1 second return back to the start position. We're familiar with this one, the shortening of the muscle. Now the final number, if it said 4010, let's say, or 3011, would be the isometric pause in the end range of the concentric. So let's just say 3011. So you go down in 3, 2, 1 for the eccentric. There's no pause at the bottom position. You return back for 1 second, and now we're requiring you to hold for 1 second in the end range of that concentric. And again, you may use this to overload an area of weakness and spend some extra time in that position. Now the final one we spoke about is isokinetics. We won't be using this too much in what you're doing, but for example, if your tempo said 2020, it would basically mean 2 seconds down in the eccentric, no pause in the eccentric end range, 2 seconds back again, and no pause in the concentric end range. And you'd perform that for the desired repetitions. Now, as I said before, what it also allows myself and Natalie to do, and yourselves, is to understand how much tension a muscle is going through. And this gives you light on how much weight you should be lifting and what the training effect would be. So let's look at the maths of it. If you were given 4010 on your program card, that's 4 seconds eccentric, no seconds eccentric end range pause, 1 second concentric, 0 seconds on the concentric end range pause, and you were given 10 repetitions, for argument's sake, you would then go 4 seconds plus 0 seconds plus 1 second plus 0 seconds, which would give you a total of 5 seconds on that tempo. You would then times that by the repetition bracket you were given. So let's say 10 reps. That is 50 seconds of work. Now that 50 seconds of work allows us all to see that the muscle will be under that much tension during that set. It also allows us to go, okay, that much amount of tension equals to a muscle building kind of property. Now obviously the higher the tension, the more strength endurance, the more muscle building it would be. The lower the tension, the more strength based the exercise would be, or power based. So it allows us to see what we're dealing with. It also allows us to go, how much weight should you be lifting? Now as a rule of thumb, if there's a small time under tension, you're likely to be either lifting very heavy or moving very quick. If the time under tension is really long, so let's say 50 plus, then you know that the load that you're going to be lifting is moderate to light. And what this tempo allows us to do is predict the time under tension your muscle is working, the training effect we're after, and it also allows us to emphasize the portion of the lift that we really want to overload. So as we run through your programs, there'll be elements of the different lifts and how we're going to build you into doing it well, dictated by the type of tempo you're given. I hope this helps. But one thing you should also recognize with tempo is it gives you an opportunity to master the skill of the exercise. And so a lot of your tempos to begin with in the phases of work you've been given will have longer eccentrics, will have more time under tension pauses at different ranges, because we want you to start to master the lifts before we go, here you go guys, loads of heavy weight. And if we do things this way around, we will have good skill acquisition around the lifts that you're working with. Again, if you have any questions on tempo, never hesitate to ask myself and Natalie, but I hope this clarifies tempo.